Start.
Edmund Spenser was born in 1552. He was admitted to the Merchant Taylors' School in 1561 and to Pembroke College, Cambridge in 1569, where he studied classical literature and the poetry of modern languages. One of his fellow students was Lancelot Andrewes, who would become a distinguished theologian and bishop. In 1580, he was named secretary to Lord Grey, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, and he followed him to Dublin, where he would spend the rest of his life in Ireland. He wrote the first 3 books of the Fairy Queen in 1589 with a letter of introduction to Sir Walter Raleigh. He dedicated it to the Queen, and he got an annual pension, but it wasn't enough for him to live on in London, which is very expensive then as now. So he returned to Ireland in 1591. He married Elizabeth Boyle in 1594. She was a member of the Anglo-Irish community in Dublin, but Spenser's work was in Cork, where he acquired a castle, Culman Castle in County Cork. In 1598, he was named the Sheriff of Cork, but almost immediately thereafter, there was a rebellion that broke out under the Earl of Tyrone, and his castle was burnt, and he had to flee with his family. In December of that year, the provincial governor sent him as a messenger to Queen Elizabeth. He arrived in London at the end of 1598, much weakened. He presented his messages to the Queen with a reiteration of his position on the Irish problem. Since he was seriously ill, he, not surprisingly, died in London on January 16, 1599, and was buried in the Poet's Corner. His greatest work was undoubtedly The Fairy Queen, which is both a national epic and a romantic epic. His poem celebrates the Tudors, Queen Elizabeth, and the English nation. Spenser's letter to Walter Raleigh describes the poem as an allegory and invites us to interpret the characters and adventures in the several books in terms of particular virtues and vices. The Red Cross Knight in Book 1 is the Knight of Holiness, and that will be the focus of what I'll quote from Wall's book. Wall tells us that Spenser was actually a rigorous critic of Elizabeth's court and the society that supported it, but he lived in a culture where criticism had to be voiced in the language of compliment if it was to be heard at all. Wall considers Spenser to be the quintessential poet of the Church of England. Reasserting Cranmer's view of religion as functional for change, Spenser employed allusions to prayer book modes of language to assert the need to participate in God's actions in English history through word and sacrament. Seeking to avoid Puritan confessionalism and the destruction of English worship, he sought to involve the Queen once more in supporting the aims of the Church created in her father's and brother's religion. One of Spenser's agendas is the redefinition of the Christian life as one based not on the monastic model of private devotion, celibate living in same-sex communities, and individual devotion on a heroic scale, but on the ancient and now recovered familial model in which the communion table is the focus of parish life. So let us love, dear love, like as we ought. Love is the lesson which the Lord has taught. There's a transformation of eroticism from the medieval courtly love with its goal of the direction of erotic energy into ascent of a spiritual ladder ending with prayer to God and made possible by devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. The Reformed Christianity of the prayer book took away the hierarchy of ascent through the Blessed Virgin. It denied at once to channel the directions of the Christian life. It dared to channel the directions of the Christian life through the domestic and social arrangements of English society. Cranmer reinforced this by having the official primers for books of family prayer, not individual devotion, which orient religious life outside of church in relationship to the worship of the community, not in the devotion to saints or other private exercises. What is called for is a transformation of social structures which allows for an affirmation of erotic desire and for achievement of its fulfillment, as well as for amelioration of its destructive potential. So next says a discussion of the poetics of Christian commonwealth in the Faerie Queene, and Wall concentrates on book 1, which has to do with the Red Cross. Toward the end of book 1 of the Faerie Queene, a godly aged sire leads the Red Cross knight, the central figure of the book, to the highest mount of the fairy landscape and shows him the little path which directs Red Cross's view to a godly city, to a goodly city. This episode bears careful examination because it comes at a critical point in Red Cross's journey into the court of Gloriana, to the land where Una's parents are held prisoner by the dragon which Red Cross has set out to slay. Prior to the episode in which this ascent to the highest mount takes place, Red Cross has wandered aimlessly through fairyland, meeting with one disaster after another, used until he is finally rescued from the giant Orgoglio by Prince Arthur and reunited with Una. From thence far off, he unto him did show a little path that was both steep and long, which to a godly city led his view, whose walls and towers were builded high and strong of pearl and precious stone, that earthly tongue cannot describe, nor wit of man can tell. Too high a ditty for my simple song. The city of the great king hight it well, wherein eternal peace and happiness doth dwell. Red Cross wakes from his dream of wanton bliss and wicked joy to behold the image of Una, which for us is finally verbal and which the Red Cross takes as a verbal, it takes on a verbal quality. When Red Cross, though profoundly disturbed, does not yield to the speaking picture of Una, the magician Archimago takes another approach. Spenser parallels these two stories of Red Cross's sites using the principle of organization announced by Richard Hooker. The problem is not the presence of erotic feeling between Red Cross and Una, or of the bodily manifestation of human life. Thrice happy man the knight himself did hold, possessed of his lady's heart and soul, heart and hand, and ever when his eye did her behold, his heart did seem to melt in pleasures manifold. The issue is what will move us from the arena of fantasy to the arena of fulfillment. That, Spenser claims, involves its incorporation into a socially acceptable and socially supported context. Spenser's depiction of his fairy world constitutes a profound reinterpretation of his medieval inheritance that is as much judgment as acceptance. His version can point to a new potential ending for Arthurian writing, substituting the building of a Christian commonwealth in Tudor England to its failure in the collapse of the Round Table Fellowship. Spenser's great experiment is to attempt a new reading of married love as eros and passion, is to attempt a new reading of married love as eros and passion disruptive of the society as lust, a transformation of truth and falsehood in societal understandings through a transformation in its terms of understanding. Following up on the first book of the Fairy Queen and Red Cross, we have a homiletics of marriage based upon the epithalamion, which is regarded as one of the greatest love poems in English literature. The Fairy Queen, Book 1 of The Fairy Queen leads into a discussion of the epithalamion. In the epithalamion, Spenser uses a specific occasion of a wedding to proclaim how divine love works through such seemingly insignificant events by which the kingdom is being built and the promises of divine love move toward their fulfillment. So the epithalamion includes an expression of the lover's passion joined with a religious sensibility. The epithalamion becomes an outpost of the city of God in time because it is a temporal gate to the city. Marriage has a role as an effective sign of the workings of divine love in time, and which Spenser exploits fully in his poem. I mean, we remember his marriage to Elizabeth Boyle in 1594, a very intense and devoted marriage that is certainly behind this beautiful poem. Spenser suggests that we think of the poem to the extent to which it describes a circularity as a ring, a verbal version of the wedding ring central to weddings in the Church of England, one of the chief points of controversy between the English Church and the Puritans, who objected to its use as a remnant of papistical departure from the biblical ceremonial of the primitive church. The wedding actually takes place in stanza 13 of the epithalamion, or in the midst of the poem, where the giving of a ring is not mentioned. Through making of the ring a poem and of the poem a ring, Spenser can make the poem into an ornament to the beloved and for short time an endless monument. In the prayer book rite itself, the ring plays a central and defining role. With this ring I thee wed. But the giving of the ring is not an end in itself, nor a completion of an action, but a beginning. For the priest goes on in the rite to pray that these persons may surely perform and keep the vow and covenant between them made, whereof this ring is given and received as a token and pledge. Thus, the giving of the ring, like the giving of the poem, is an action in anticipation of future action, which will give meaning to the former action, since the giving of the ring is a token and pledge that the vow and covenant it initiates shall be performed and kept, so that only through such ongoing action does the giving and receiving of the ring come to have meaning. Although marriage had no official status as a sacrament in the Tudor Anglican Church, the rite follows the models of baptism and Eucharist in joining the enacting of a verbal text with things and actions. There is thus at the center of the epithalamion a situating of the poem in relationship to another ongoing process of discourse, as in the case of Book 1 of The Fairy Queen, consequences for actions and meanings are brought to bear on the poem and are acted out within it. To the extent to which images of the eternal become present through being enfolded into the temporal world of the poem, they show us the importance of that day in terms of its relationship to past saving acts and the future they have in common. Spenser uses the classical tradition of epithalamion, while all the while demystifying the authority of these models. In claiming his role as the singer of the poem, in which, in the first stanza, Spenser's speaker compares himself to Orpheus. Help me, mine own love's prayers to resound. So Orpheus did for his own bride. On the other hand, the speaker evokes for himself the Orphic role of a poet, a classical condition demonstrating the authority and power of poetry to be so great that it could charm Pluto and bring him to release Eurydice from Hades. And when ye list your own mishaps to mourn, which death or love or fortune's wreck did raise, your string would soon to sadder and teach the words and waters to lament your doleful detriment. Of course, you know the story. Eurydice goes back to Hades when the condition is broken that Orpheus should not turn to look at her. But this isn't what happens in the English marriage ceremony. On the contrary, but her sad eyes, still fastened on the ground, are governed with goodly modesty that suffers not one look to glance awry, which may let in a little thought unsowed. Why blush ye, love, to give to me your hand? So the giving of the hand in the marriage rite. Why blush ye, love, to give to me your hand, the pledge of all our band? Sing ye, sweet angels, alleluia sing, that all the woods may answer and your echo ring. In the context of the biblical and liturgically enacted word, therefore, Spenser's poem can complete and surpass the Orphic parallel. Although Orpheus called his bride from Hades, while the speaker of epithalamion calls his bride only from her bower in terms of the biblical proclamation about God's actions in history, the success this speaker has in his calling forth is itself an assertion that the word that speaks through the epithalamion acts in such ordinary and specific moments to call God's people from death unto life, from darkness unto light, from a fear of eros and its destructive potential into a sexually charged marital relationship blessed in its potential fecundity by the church. It is therefore appropriate that Spenser ends his poem in prayer to ye high heavens. Pour out your blessing on us plenteously, and happy influence upon us reign. that we may raise a large posterity, which from the earth, which they may long possess with lasting happiness, up to your haughty palaces may mount, and for the guerdon of their glorious merit, may heavenly tabernacles there inherit of blessed saints, for to increase the count. So let us rest, sweet love, in hope of this. Thank you.